Well, good morning. My name is Tony Christ. Our program is Sunshine and Transparency. I want to welcome you to it. Let's see. We could say a few words about some some other things before we get to our topic today. The markets are very turbulent right now, and they're headed down. And I don't see a change in that or in the direction uh, uh, for a while. They were overdone, and they're now paying the price of it. And it's somewhat sobering. All the money that's been poured into the system by the government in the last 4 years has actually scared me for quite a while. We've done a couple podcasts on it, and we're going to talk about it again today. Uh, in our productivity, our part two on productivity. I'm going to bring it up to date, but it's a scary environment, uh, and uh, and it really smacks of a bubblicious environment. People are not aware of the consequences of what's occurred in the last 4 years. And I think there's going to be, I hate to say it this way, but I think there's going to be a price to pay. And we may be starting to pay it sooner than we think. That said, let's move on to productivity part two. And we're focused on labor productivity. There are two or three different measures of productivity, but labor is 70 to 75% of it. And I want to just focus on it. And these are proxies, so to speak, for productivity. They're estimates by economists. And basically, in labor productivity, they take labor cost and divide it into gross domestic product. And of course, the bigger the number, the more productive the system is. And so you're taking costs away from output and you're seeing what's left. And then they compare it year to year to see if it's going up and at what rate it's going up. And when you look at America and you go back to 1947 to 1967, our productivity was fantastic. We were going up 3.2% a year. That's from 1947 to 67. However, after 67 to present, which is well over 50 years, 55, 57 years, productivity has averaged about 1.5% a year. Now that's still positive, but we want to focus in on the periods that we've immediately gone through, particularly the first 3 years of the Trump administration. There's a reason we're leaving 2020 out, and I'll get to that in a second. And the first 3 years of the Biden administration. And we want to look at what labor productivity was in those years. And and our source is Bureau of Labor Statistics. We're using the government. However, they're measuring it, we're assuming they're committing the same errors and doing it to the same correct method each year so that we can judge the relative numbers. So during the Trump years, Mr. Trump averaged 1.7%. That's 0.2% above the average going back many, many decades. And Mr. Biden averaged during 21, 22, and 23, 0.5%, 0.5%. That's significantly below the average, 3% below the average, and 3.6% below Trump's labor productivity. And that's somewhat telling because of all the money that was spent. There's been more money spent in Trump's fourth year and Biden's 3.5 years than I've ever seen in my life. And when you spread money like that, it tends to immediately stimulate, but the effects fade very quickly. And what are you left with? I mean, after you spend that money, what are you left with? Well, I'm going to tell you what you're left with. You're left with a bigger debt. You're left with a bigger amount of money you owe. And our debt is going through the roof. Right now, we're at 900 billion, approaching a trillion in interest only on the debt. We've never been in this kind of a world before, not even during World War II. And this is all self-inflicted. This is not. This is all done by the Federal Reserve and our politicians. No citizen is responsible for any of it, and I don't care if you're a Democrat, Republican, whatever you are. You're not responsible for what this debt creation or the spending or the artificial interest rates, which facilitated a lot of it. And right now, we're getting into a precarious position because if, in fact, our GDP, our gross domestic product, which is the total of all goods and services, goes negative, and of course, the definition of a recession is for it to be negative for 2 quarters, the percent we have to pay on interest on the debt goes up because the country is not making as much money as it was. Many people have to get laid off too. We're beginning to see the start of that occurring. And the question of how far it's going to go and how deep, we've never really been in this situation before. It's very hard to predict. So I can say this, that the difference between Trump's 3 years at 1.7 non-farm labor productivity per year in 2017, 2018, and 2019, that was the average, and Biden's 0.5% in 21, 22, 23, the 3.6% difference is well over $1 trillion. So that lost productivity is apparent by a reduction in GDP. Even though the gross domestic product went up 5-6%, if the productivity had stayed the same as it did during Trump's 3 years, it would have been much higher. Okay, so that lost productivity is something politicians don't like talking about, particularly the the Biden people who are in there right now. They don't want to talk about a loss in productivity, not when they're on this epic, once in a generation spending binge, which seems to have no end to it. But what could cause it to end? What could bring it to an end is their inability to borrow. And that's very tied to the debt. And that would be a world we've never had in America. They have had it in other countries, and it creates defaults in the debt, and it's a very very bad place to be. And we're right up there. We're right up in the stratosphere with debt right now. So what do we do? And what does this mean? And if there's anybody that's not clear on why it's bad, you have nothing better to do than look back in history. If you go back to a guy named David Ricardo, in 1815, he wrote an essay, The Influence of a Low Price of Corn on Profits. Now, David Ricardo is considered to be the father of one of the basic elemental laws in economics. It's called diminishing returns. But what does that mean? Well, return is something you get back from labor. And David Ricardo looked at the world as in production, the world of production, having three components: labor, land, and capital. And his theory of diminishing returns said, if you overdid one of the components, let's say capital, if you overdid it, you would get an initial surge, but then the return would diminish and continue to diminish, even if you continued stimulating. Now, we certainly have gotten an initial surge from Mr. Biden's spending binge, and we're still at the tail ends of it. But it started to diminish, and non-farm labor productivity is diminished too. The amount of output per worker has dropped to 0.5% a year. And if you go back to 20, actually, the actual measurement can go up and down in the short term. Even to look at it in a year may be a little bit deceptive, because you also have to look at what's going on with borrowing and what's going on with other factor inputs. But the basic fact of productivity is workers, if you produce more, there's more output. And if there's more output, there's more wealth and welfare socially. And it's a very simple calculation. In a general sense, you take expense out of output and you see what's left. Now, of course, if expenses are greater than output, you're in negative territory. And in many public companies today, they are. But of course, we expect the future to change, and we expect their outputs to be greater. Or if they're not, they go out of business. They gave it a shot and they couldn't make it. So what are these two huge factors that have created this gigantic input of capital in Trump's fourth year, okay? And in all three of of Biden's years, and half of this year. What is it? Well, in Trump's fourth year, he had the COVID stimulus plan, 2.3 trillion. We've never had anything by government as large as 2.3 trillion outside of World War II, and it wasn't trillion then either, but we've never had anything that big. And Biden got in, and then what he claims were positive passages, the Infrastructure Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS Act. And then it goes on and on. The student forgiveness. Actually, it's our money that was forgiven, not Biden. It never is Biden. It's always our money. These programs are trillion-dollar programs. They're not small programs. They're multiple year, and they've created gigantic inputs of capital into the labor and land situation, and they're showing a diminishing return, which is what David Ricardo said. Initially, the stimulus shoots things upward, and then over time, you get a diminishing return. And since the capital was borrowed by our government, you end with debt and an obligation to pay the debt. And the expense of that debt right now is approaching $16,000 for every worker in America per year. $16,000 per year for every worker in America. That's unbelievable. And so when we look at what caused this, what allowed this to happen, a starting point is to go back to Ben Bernanke, when he came into the Federal Reserve, and he served from 2006 to 2014. Okay. And we want to look at what M2 was, and we also want to look at the Fed's balance sheet. M2 is a broad measure of money in the system, of US dollars in the system. And the Fed's balance sheet tells us how much money they printed to put new money in the system. So when Ben Bernanke got in office in 2006, the Fed's balance sheet was a little bit over 800 billion. That means from George Washington to President Bush, they kept the balance sheet to less than $800 billion. Ben Bernanke, in his term, in his 8-year term, took the balance sheet from 800 billion to 4.5 trillion. Now you got to remember, when that money is printed, it gets in the system, it grows bigger. So when you look at the amount of money in the system when Ben Bernanke got there, measured by M2, there were $6.748 trillion in the world circulating. When Ben Bernanke left in January of 2014, there were $11.105 trillion. Now that's an 84% growth in the money supply in the system in just 8 years. 84%. Now, Ben had a philosophy that was based on the Great Depression. And he thought they had made critical errors in the Great Depression. And he thought if he printed, it would avoid those errors. Now, the question isn't to avoid an error. The question is to correct it. Avoidance of it or postponement might just be putting it off. And basically, I think that's what Ben's strength was. And they used to call him Helicopter Ben, because they had a picture of Ben printing money and flying around. Well, printed money does what to the value of the dollar? It lowers it. I mean, if I have an economic system, call it Tony's economy, and I have $100,000, and everybody in Tony's economy is saying, no, we need more money. I said, all right, print another 100,000. Well, you know what happens to the prices of things? They double. All else equal, they will double to reflect that same exchange rate that you had when you only had 100,000. And basically, that's where inflation comes from. And that rule is, I think, immutable. It's been discussed a lot, and it's been questioned a lot during this century, but people are actually returning to a more sensible notion of it. Economists are. Now, Ben Bernanke affected Janet Yellen and Jerome Powell, the two Fed chairmen since. Matter of fact, Janet Yellen was a complete clone of Ben Bernanke. She didn't change a thing he did. She held interest rates artificially low, and she printed and printed. And she still is out there on her own doing things that have never, you never see in the American financial system. Like, she allows all banks to hold their bond assets at maturity, not mark to market. I mean, that's such a big difference. That allows dozens and dozens of banks to appear that they have a tangible value when they don't. just by her declaration. And now she's Treasury Secretary. But the two together took the money supply from 11.105 trillion in January of 2014 when Ben left to June of 2024 to 21 trillion, 24 billion dollars. That's an increase of 89% in 10 and a half years. So they really kept up Ben's rate of growth, almost to the percent. Actually, Ben grew it a little bit quicker. But the point is, where are we now? Because the credit worthiness of our currency is being challenged, and we're having people sell U.S. debt, which was pretty much unheard of. Net people, foreigners, selling U.S. debt. Japan just sold 20-some billion. They're holding the biggest holding. They have 1.1 trillion. It's estimated they're going to be selling another 400 billion to prop up the yen. So if we don't have foreign buyers and debt, that only leaves us two ways to pay for our debt. Because every week you hear about auctions, debt comes due, and we have to take out more debt. And we're also spending $2 trillion a year more than we have. So we have to issue that additional 2 trillion in debt every year, in addition to replacing the debt that comes due. So where is that going to come from? Well, there's only two other places. One is the bank reserves in America, and the other one is the Federal Reserve printing more money. So in the world of productivity, it is going to be challenged for quite a while now until these issues get resolved. Productivity, labor output, if you do lapse into a recession in 6 months, you have to really not rely on the numbers that come out in the next two sequential quarters, because by definition, the quarters will have been negative or it won't be a recession. And you can't rely on them because you get a massive drop off in labor. And when you lose that much labor and you divide expense into output, it tends to overstate output. Now, that's what happened in 2024, where you had, a ton of Americans dropped out of the labor force over COVID at once. So it sort of misstated productivity. It jumped up to over 5%. But that's why we're not using 2020 to compare those two, the prior 3 years of Trump to the first 3 years of Biden. But it does tell you something. When you listen to the administrations, the political administrations, both the Democrat and Republican, they're focused on unemployment, U3 unemployment. They don't even look at U6, or it's mentioned on that day, but the newscasts and everything don't focus on it. The political types focus on unemployment, which is only the number of people that are unemployed out of the labor force. And in order to be in the labor force, you have to have been looking for a job in the last few days. If you're not, you may still need work, but you're not counted in the labor force. Now, when you take U6, the unemployment rate jumps up to over 7.6%. And these things are going to have an effect on gross domestic product. It's going to shrink and go down, and they also are going to have an effect on that non-farm labor productivity number in time. It's going to go down too, and might go negative. So now the only silver lining and I have to use history again to illustrate it. In 1994, when Bill Clinton was president for his second term, well, actually not quite his second term yet, the second half of his first term, Newt Gingrich took over because the Republicans won control of the House. And they started to block some of Clinton's spending, and interest rates started to come down. Okay. And at that time, there was something else going on. It was called adoption of the internet, the technological change that added tremendous amount of productivity. Actually, the highest recorded productivity, even higher than 47 to 67's average, was about to unfold. We touched 3.5% productivity from 94 to 2001 as we adopted the internet. Think of it. Think of all the time that was saved, and therefore the productivity that was gained. And that was a very dramatic thing. As a matter of fact, Clinton balanced two budgets and had small surpluses. Now that was in I believe 98 and 99. And now the politicians took credit. Bill Clinton took credit, Al Gore took credit, and later when he ran, he took credit again. Newt Gingrich, let me tell you something. None of the politicians, not the Republican Gingrich, not Gore or Clinton, had anything to do with the productivity that was gained. It was the adoption of the internet. So I bring it up because now we're looking toward the future, adoption of AI. And we know everything on that level has a good and a bad use, and but AI is going to be a huge productivity booster, but I don't know that it's going to be significant in the next 2 to 3 years. In other words, we could easily have a recession and come down and have productivity decline, go negative possibly, before AI gets implemented. And that is as plausible as any scenario I think is out there. But AI will be a huge boost to productivity. Now, it doesn't get us out of our spending hole. Now, we go back to Ronald Reagan. He said his biggest regret. Now, this was a presidential candidate who had 78% popular opinion. He said he could not reduce expenses in the bureaucracy. When a bureaucracy, a government, gets entrenched, it's almost impossible to reduce expenses. Economists have discussed it for the better part of a century, going back to Shoemaker and Schumpeter. Schumpeter started, then Shoemaker, and recently the Rise and Decline of Nations featured it with economists from the University of Maryland. But it is almost impossible to reduce a bureaucracy, to reduce the size. And there's going to be a lot of rigidity and inability to reduce this one. So that's what the political class is facing. Plus, in addition, which is also a negative for future productivity, the population, we've had arguably the worst political class for decades in America. Why? Well, I'm going to quote Paul Tsongas, a Democrat from Massachusetts who ran for president and unfortunately withdrew. In 1990, I heard him speak in Washington, and he said his biggest fear was the feeling of entitlement. And I frankly have not seen any politician that didn't use that as an advantage, promising gifts to the public to get in elected office. And Joe Biden is the master of that. There's never been a politician as good at it as Joe. Joe makes up for his weak leadership by spending public money. The tragedy is it's our money, okay, and we have to pay it back. But there's no plan to do that. And it does affect productivity. I mean, we had a period in the 1970s where the term crowding out came about because the debt got so big in the 70s due to a very big slowdown in the economy that to pay for the debt crowded out other investments because the debt's always first in line. Every week, monies have to be raised to refinance issues that come due and to raise money for the out of control spending of the government to pay for what they're doing right now, which is, as I said, almost $2 trillion that they won't collect that we're spending this year. And that is a huge hole. So, and it's going to have a huge effect on productivity until we get to AI, in which case we're going to get some real big jumps in productivity. So David Ricardo, this has been known in economics, is my point, for 200 years, over 200 years, that you can't throw capital into the system and get an everlasting growth effect from it. You get an initial surge, initial feel-good feeling, which we've had, and now you're going to get the decline. Even as you throw more capital in, the decline will keep declining and eventually go negative. And we're experiencing that right now. And the difference between growth and debt is real simple. Debt is a constant, it doesn't change. Growth can go up and down. And apparently ours is going down right now. So that's the tragedy of it. That's a tragedy the political class needs to answer for this whole mess. As I said, starting with Trump. Now, you can make the excuse for Trump because he did face with COVID something that was unique and we hadn't faced ever. But Biden has just been a catastrophic spender, and he's just not stopping. Every day he's there, he spends more. And of course, his vice president has been with him too on this spending binge. And they talk about taxing the rich. Well, the rate that they're spending on is off the charts, and it's not going to be as simple as taxing the rich to get out of it. I wish it were, but it's not going to be that simple. So basically, you do have a decline, in a significant decline in productivity in the first 3 years of the Biden administration compared to the first 3 years of the Trump administration. And again, we're not counting 2020 because the huge effect of the drop off in employment overstated the productivity number. It jumped up to over 5%. And that was a bit of an anomaly. So we're not counting 2020 because of that labor drop off, which did return in pieces over 21 and 22. It did return to the labor force. So this is a very huge area. It's not emphasized by the media or the press, but you want to have an economy that's productive. Now, China, and I just mentioned this, their productivity has come down, but it's come down to a little under 5% a year. That's hugely more productive than we are. And that should be a real a wake-up call for us. Why are they hugely more productive? Okay, we need to figure that one out. And because it doesn't matter that we're in competition, it doesn't matter that they're antagonistic in many respects. Why are they hugely more productive? Why is their non-farm labor productivity over 300% higher than ours, even though it's declined? That's a question we don't focus on. And does it make sense to cut off trade with China? No, it doesn't. But that's another day, another lecture. Now, we're going to dovetail from labor productivity next week into what is an interest rate. And this century, we've had a Federal Reserve that, frankly, has been off the reservation most of the century. They've expanded their duties and their jobs, and effectively they've tethered together our whole banking industry, which scares me to death. I mean, it used to be last century, if a bank messed up, it would go out of business, okay? And others would look at it and would correct. But today, because of this excessive overreach in the Federal Reserve, they've taken over many of the traditional banking responsibilities. And one of the most elemental ones is controlling the interest rate. Why is an interest rate important if we intend to protect our currency? What does an interest rate communicate? Well, an interest rate, and I'm going to give you a few words on this, and then we're going to cut it off for the day. An interest rate is the price of money. It's what money costs. Now, what if the interest rate is the same as the rate of inflation? Say it's 3%. Well, money's costless. It has no price. What if it's less than the inflation rate? Well, money is negative. It not only has no price, it has a negative price. So you can go back now to, and again, we go back to Mr. Bernanke, and he kept interest rates artificially low. Janet Yellen came in, she kept interest rates artificially low. Jerome Powell came in, he kept interest rates artificially low. Whoops, until he couldn't. Until what? Until inflation exploded. Okay. And he was forced to raise them. Now he's going to lower them again soon. But the point is, if you don't have a real interest rate, your money is costless. It doesn't have, it still has a transaction value. Okay. It's still, you can trade it for other things, but it loses its price. It doesn't have a price, or the price is minimized. And the other thing the interest rate tells us is risk. In other words, you're going to get a lower interest rate on a home mortgage than you would if you wanted to start a business. Okay, because there's more, particularly if you put 20% down on the home mortgage, you're going to get a lower interest rate because it's less risk. You're going to get, at least up until now, the lowest rate on federal debt, because up until now, for our history over 250 years, we paid it back every time, unlike most countries, and unlike what we might be facing shortly, unfortunately. But so you're going to get the lowest interest rate on debt. But so it not only reflects risk, it also reflects duration. In other words, a shorter term loan traditionally will be a little lower interest rate than a longer term loan. But if you don't have a positive interest rate, an interest rate higher than the inflation rate, your money has no price. And we've spent much of this century with no interest rate, with no positive price to the cost of money, no price at all, oftentimes. So, what does that make your money worth? Why do you think crypto exploded this century? It does have the blockchain advantage. I'm not going to say it doesn't. But why do you think it exploded this century? Because money was held down. The interest rate on money was artificially held low by Ben Bernanke, who started it, Janet Yellen, and Jerome Powell for way too long. And crypto came up. Crypto, of course, doesn't have an interest rate at all either. Neither does gold. But there are alternatives that also aren't subject to these tremendous growth in the stock. As we cited in Bernanke's time, the money supply grew 84% in 8 years, and actually, let's call it 19 years from Bernanke, because it was Bernanke's philosophy that has affected them all. So for 19 years, from 2006 to 2024, almost over with, for almost 19 years, the money supply has grown about 88%. Okay, it's gone from 6,748,000,000,000 to 21,024,000,000,000 to 21 trillion. So that in that period of time, it's grown it's grown 300%. Oh, over 300%. Okay, over 300%. Well, that's a much faster growth rate than crypto or gold. Gold notoriously adds about 2% a year. Okay, well, 2% a year for 18 years is not 300%. Okay, 2% a year for 18 years might be about 180%. And crypto is even a much slower rate of growth. So people realizing that the government was devaluing the currency, lowering the value of their money, i.e. prices go up, same thing, right? Your money's worth less, the price goes up, called inflation. That the government was behind this, starting with Ben Bernanke all century. And let me just put it in perspective. Prior to the Federal Reserve's formation in 1913, all the way back to the beginning of the country, money depreciated at about 1% a year, not 2, 1. When the Fed took over in 1913, their single mission was protecting the value of the money. Well, what happened? It started depreciating at twice the amount, at 2%. That's their sole mission. And they doubled the rate of depreciation. Now, they took on another job, full employment, much later. And their initial job for decades was to protect the value of the dollar. Now, this century, since Ben Bernanke has come on board, the depreciation rate is much higher than 2. Okay, much higher. And we're just barely clinging to the reserve currency, and God help us if we lose that. And believe me, unless we have a dramatic change in our fiscal responsibilities, which I see no sign of from either candidate, we're getting near the precipice of having that problem. So labor productivity is so basically elemental. It's not how many people are working and whether they're less working or more working. It's how much productivity you get out of one worker. Is it a positive number? Is that person producing more than their expense? And if they are, is it growing? Are they using equipment and technology able to produce even more? That's what creates wealth. And that's what improves our welfare. That's the only thing, not the number of people working, the productivity per worker. And of course, with more productive workers, you want to have a larger labor force, but they have to be productive. And that contrast with China underscores the decline in our labor productivity and the question why. And then the recent years, comparing Trump to Biden, even though there's been massive expenditure, massive insertions of capital into the system by this once ever spending binge started by Trump and continued by Biden. The initial upward surge is over. No matter how much more money you borrow and put in, according to David Ricardo, you're going to decline. Your return is going to decline to 0, and then it's going to decline and go negative. You could put another trillion in tomorrow and another trillion in the next day. It's going to go negative. You can't just take one factor of production and throw money at it and have it increase production for any sustainable period of time. And that's a fact. David Ricardo knew it in 1815, but none of the people, including their advisors, know it today. Apparently, or if they do, They're just deceiving us. What Biden has done in spending in the hole, in creating the hole for America and spending, is the most criminal thing I've ever seen in my life. Spending unendingly, using money to compensate for his poor leadership, and it's such a tragedy. And he's reinforced a bad habit that Paul Tsongas talked about in 1990, which was a feeling of entitlement, and how so many politicians have gone out with gifts to the public from a country that is technically bankrupt, technically insolvent, and nobody's willing to recognize it. Neither political party. So we're hopeful though that when AI is implemented into the system, it's going to create another level of productivity and help to offset this horrific binge of spending and the hole it's put us in. And that's our hope. Next week, we're going to talk about interest rates. I want you to attend because you need to understand how important they are, because they also are feedback for us. They tell us what to invest in. But if you take the interest rate away, you lose your perception of risk. You're deceived by an artificially low interest rate. You're not allowed to see what the risk of your borrowing is. And this is a whole nother area. We're going to talk about it next week. We hope you continue to attend. We're all about trying to get to the truth. We're going to sound political from time to time, but we want to stick with the truth. And we believe that what we need in America is more labor productivity and more effective labor and productive labor. And we cannot close out trade. Trade is just an essential way that benefits Americans. We can't try to hammer out trade. It's going to hurt every American. So I want you to have a blessed week. This is Tony Christ, Sunshine and Transparency. We're going to come on again next week. We're going to talk about interest rates. Have a blessed week, and you might want to get out of the stock markets. That's my advice. Have a good week.